So, one of the first things the new principal did at Maktab Sains was to rearrange her office so that it was unapproachable by teachers or by students. She changed the entrance to be a side door. The front door was arranged so that it resembled, or the front office was arranged so that it resembled an old style bank with a high platform type counter through which the tiny, almost invisible workers behind it could hardly be seen. On this platform was a bell, which, as a teacher, had to press for attention. It was designed to diminish and intimidate the visitor. The teachers hardly knew she was there, but she was there all right. When we were teaching, she would open the door, look in, and then close the door again without saying a word. How rude. She then had a little square hole cut in each classroom door. Glass was then put in each hole so that she could look in while we were teaching. Even more rude. The gates of the school were closed and teachers' number plates asked for so that she could keep track of who was entering and leaving the school and when. If we went to the airport, we were supposed to get an official at the airport to stamp a form to stay, to say that they had seen us at the airport. Because everyone knew this lady was unapproachable, she had nothing to do at all, a fact which therefore compounded her incompetence, as she did absolutely nothing. It was management by default. The head of department in the school was almost completely ignored by this person, and her equally incompetent lapdog, the deputy principal. The heads of department were asked to do the dirty work, but were kept in the mushroom club for most of the time. Aye, they were kept in the dark and fed shit. The HOD of the English department was a lovely person, but she could not stand up to this principal or take up an issue on behalf of her teachers. She also was quite easily manipulated by some expatriate teachers who shamelessly ended up getting all the easy classes with very few students in them. Not surprisingly, this caused resentment amongst the rest of us. The principal gathered around her a coterie of poker-faced attack dogs who carried out her wishes and whims, sometimes unwillingly, but sometimes with undisguised relish. These were the one and the same people who, in the previous year with a previous principal, had been quite pleasant colleagues, inoffensive. Now there were no smiles, no greetings, and these stooges patrolled the corridors, writing down the names of teachers in the morning who were late for their registration duties. Teachers who had taught in the school for many years, even 10 or more, were not farewelled at any formal function. They just disappeared, often in the middle of the year. The deputy principal saw fit to allocate the lower sixth classes, the senior classes, to non-air-conditioned rooms. Why? No one really knew this, as there were many spare rooms with air conditioning available. In other words, it just wasn't important to her that the students or the teacher were comfortable. In the first week, I moved into one of these empty rooms and I stayed there for the rest of the year. A serious crime, no doubt, in her eyes. No wonder, perhaps, that I ended up on the veto list. There was one PC for 22 English teachers in our staff room, and repeated requests for another PC were ignored. And the one PC had no access to the internet. Only the computer labs had this, and they didn't work all of the time and were often used by the computer and other departments for classes. Being science teachers, neither the principal nor the deputy principal had any idea of how labor-intensive debating was for teachers. So, as a debating coach, we were not allowed to practice during class time. Yet, students were out of my class in English for myriads of other similar activities. I had to go personally, I remember, to the previous principal to get my classes to follow on from Form 4 to Form 5. The GCSE English was a 2-year course. It is much more efficient to take the classes for the 2 years. But the deputy didn't understand this and didn't like it. Why? Because it was more difficult for her to administer. It gave her less flexibility. I don't know, perhaps this is why I was put on her veto list. God only knows. There were amazing things there called record books. This was a huge book which consisted of weekly lesson plans and daily lesson plans, exam marks, etc. It was largely a work of fiction. Nobody followed the plans. Most people made up the lesson plans and didn't follow them. Most people also made up the marks. I certainly did. By the end of my time at MS, I wasn't even setting any homework because students either copied it or didn't do it at all. The book had to be inspected and signed by the head of department every week and the deputy principal every 3 weeks. The deputy principal was a science teacher, as was the principal. Between them, they didn't know the difference between an English lesson and a bar of soap. But that didn't stop them from writing absurd comments on the book when they didn't like something, such as, "Where are the homework marks?" when they knew perfectly well what the situation was in reality. The ministry had some regulation that required teachers to mark one composition and one comprehension every 2 weeks. Often this was for a cohort of over 100 students. Each grammar mistake was supposed to be corrected in red ink, and the student and teacher were supposed to correct them all. Of course, no one ever did this. Having said all that, my arrival and first 2 years were very happy at Maktab Sains. For the first time in 6 years, I felt relatively valued as a teacher in Brunei. And as I said with the previous principal, the administration was relatively benign. They weren't actively supportive, but they were passively supportive. That was the best you could ask for in Brunei, as many administrators were either incapable, incompetent, inexperienced, or all three. Most schools had an environment which was toxic to professional teachers. But this was not the case in the first 2 years at Maktab Sains. I began to feel enthusiastic about teaching again. And so for the first time in years, I started to think about doing a project which would keep me happy in my spare time. And it would assist me in developing myself professionally so that I could get another job after Brunei. I eventually came up with an action research project on teacher collaboration. I was able to conceive of, design, implement, evaluate, and write up my project as a thesis for my educational doctorate from an online university in the United States. Staff in the English department generally cooperated with me, but in the end, only people who were free, that is, not teaching at the time, could be involved. I couldn't take people out of their other obligations in order to attend my meetings. This was a design fault in my project, but it was certainly better than having no project at all, as far as I was concerned. I wrote up most of the project at home in the evenings or at the Seaside Travelers Inn in Kota Kinabalu. Apart from my thesis, the most positive thing that happened professionally was the winning of the debate competition. This is something that had not happened in the school for 11 years. I certainly got some kudos from the administration for doing this. Before I arrived at Maktab Sains, an interesting event occurred as a result of a visit one day to the school by the Crown Prince. He was a nice enough fellow. Apparently, though, during his visit, he had taken a fancy to one of the sixth form girls. She was a pretty girl, of course. On his return to the palace, his aides did the needful, and within 2 months they were married. Now, the girl's mother was a Swiss lady who actually was an employee of CFBT. She was the counselor, and a very good one at that. She kept many teachers from going nuts during periods of stress. Well, she became the Queen Mother and had to give up her job at CFBT and was not seen in public after the marriage. She had no choice in the matter either. That is the way things are done in Brunei Darussalam. Returning to my thesis again, there was no needs analysis in this Orwellian world. No one was interested in the needs of the students or the teachers. It wasn't necessary because naturally the administration and management knew everything that was needed for students and teachers. Therefore, communication was nil. It was like traveling on a spaceship on an intergalactic mission with the crew in hibernation and only Hal the computer for company. The Bruneians complied as usual, thus giving tacit consent to their own oppression. And this was why I lost respect for many of them in the end. They were very likable, but I didn't respect them because they never ever stood up for themselves or each other. On the contrary, they routinely dobbed each other in order to gain brownie points for themselves at the expense of someone else. The truth is, of course, that this is not a phenomenon confined to Brunei. It is what humans do everywhere, wherever they are. When they are under pressure, they look after themselves at the expense of their peers. I've even done it myself.